Chinese stocks puked lower earlier today, primarily driven off of the education sector. The US listed Chinese stocks that are involved with tutoring and education for profit, which is TAL Education, TAL, and New Oriental Education and Technology, EDU stocks, which dropped 70 and 54% respectively. Now, the official rules that have circulated effectively say, hey, you can't raise capital going forward. You can't raise foreign capital. Certainly, you can't list it on a foreign exchange without effectively CCP direct approval. In all honesty, this might be a direct response to the DD listing, where effectively the CCP told DD don't do a public offering, don't list on the US exchanges. They did anyways, and since then the stock's been hammered. I personally thought DD's become uninvestable because of that. We'll talk more about that dynamic in a second. But this has caused investors to sell off stocks, puke Chinese stocks, because the rumors are actually even worse than just tighter regulation here, because here it is, a rumored article here in Bloomberg talks about how they're planning, China considers turning tutoring companies into nonprofits, i.e. saying, hey, this $100 billion education sector, boom, you can no longer operate at a profit. Now, obviously, if you can't operate at a profit, your value as a shareholder goes to a big donut. And that's the concern. That's the concern where all these investors are like, holy smokes, could this actually happen? That is a concerning thing, because if the CCP says, hey, you can't operate at a profit today, then what stops them from saying this next sector can't do it, and then the next sector? And that is a line in the sand that I think a lot of investors are watching. I know I certainly am watching it. So that rumor is concerning. That said, so far, what's official is that they're effectively tightening the regulation, saying, hey, we don't want you listing on a foreign exchange. We're also going to talk about the hours and the scrutiny in terms of what you can offer, what do you advertise. We'll talk more about exactly the regulation with China, tutoring, education, what's going on there in a second. But this has caused investors broadly to get a little panicky with Chinese stocks, and I think you already are starting to see that with their valuations. Also, just if this is your first time tuning in, my name is Daniel. You're watching Unrivaled Investing. This is a no-hype, mission-focused channel trying to find exceptional companies and unrivaled investments. I'm looking for potential multi-bagger stocks that could potentially go up hundreds or thousands % over time. So when you see things start getting that fear factor, Dr. Michael Burry used to talk about looking for stocks with an ick factor. That's where there are potential bargains. So if I can overlay this approach of try to find exceptional companies with great pricing, then you can have potentially really great returns over time. So I'm trying to parse through this here, saying, hey, is it still possible to have exceptional returns if you pick your spots in China with some Chinese stocks? And so we'll talk more about that in just a second. So what's been driving this dramatic drop with these Chinese education stocks? It's first worthwhile to understand, you need to have a little bit of context, where this is actually this crackdown, this regulatory crackdown has been telegraphed months in advance, where here it is, literally an article from Reuters talking about how from May, exclusive China planning new crackdown on private tutoring sector. This has been talked about and discussed for months, and maybe folks are just sort of waking up like, oh snap, they're really going to do this. I think you should always take these headlines from, let's say, the Chinese Communist Party or the South China Morning Post to sort of say, hey, whatever's the headlines here, it's worth considering. So from that article, they talk about, effectively you're dealing with sleep deprived students, where these tutoring courses have just gone crazy, where students are doing effectively like 2 jobs, where you do normal class and then you do tutoring, and you might be doing that till like 10 o'clock at night, doing, let's say, extracurriculars like learning English or all these sorts of extra programs. And so they say, yeah, it's not only hard on the students, but it also costs parents a ton. And they're trying to encourage people to have more babies, as the Chinese population grew over the 10 years to 2020 at the slowest pace in decades, raising the fear that its dwindling workforce will be unable to support an increasingly elderly population. That's a concern. So they're saying, wait a second, we want more babies to sort of help the demographic picture, and people are reluctant to have more kids when they see how costly it is because of all this tutoring that they feel they have to do. So the CCP is sort of unhappy looking at this picture, and they also are unhappy with sort of the wild development with the CCP. And the last thing the CCP wants is disruption, chaos, unhappy. If you have millions of parents, let's say, putting in tons of money, literally hundreds of millions of dollars into this tutoring, into this education for, let's say, not great results, or results that don't really yield life-changing outcomes, is that really worthwhile for everyone? And that's what the CCP is trying to crack down on, saying, hey, you don't need to spend all this money. Let's try to regulate this space so that way this money doesn't get spent in the first place. And so to understand more broadly, and once again, this has been discussed over several months. This was an article from early June, why China is cracking down now on after-school tutors. It's really driven, one, there's a national college admission test which drives a lot of pressure. So we're saying, hey, if everyone's taking the same exam, it's hard to get into one of the top universities in China. That affects my potential life outcome. And then there's been misleading advertisements by these sort of after-school programs. Now, it might not just be TAL and New Education. It might be other players also. We're effectively saying, hey, if you do our program, you're more likely to get into XYZ university, and that, or you'll get better jobs or better pay or that sort of thing. And so it does mislead folks to sort of say, oh yeah, I want to spend this money. And this has led this anxiety of making sure one's child gets into the best school and has a good life. It's led to spending a ton of money, reluctance to having more kids, fed by misleading advertisements to then say, hey, we're going to plow, millions of parents are plowing their life savings into these online classes, tutoring for, it's even like preschool. They're doing classes for preschool kids all the way through to get to these college admission exam to say, hey, you're going to score a good exam and get a good score, do well. And it's just based on a lot of anxiety, and it's a lot of work that these kids are having to do. I mean, literally, one of the rules that's been talked about over the last few months is like, yeah, the CCP is effectively saying you're not going to be allowed to offer tutoring services after 9 p.m. I mean, that's been one of the things that's been circulating because students are not getting enough sleep. They're getting pushed so far to do it to prove themselves. And that broadly, the CCP is saying, wait a second, like you're spending a ton of money and this isn't healthy for the general populace. We need like more babies, and seeing stressed out kids and parents that are stressed out paying the bills, like that's not going to cut it. And so that's, what's going on here. So what am I personally doing? Let me do a quick plug where, once again, if this is your first time tuning in, my name is Daniel. You're watching Unrivaled Investing. If you enjoy learning about potential multi-baggers, please make a point of subscribing and hitting that thumbs up button. If you want to follow my personal journey as I look and try to buy potential multi-baggers for myself, go to unrivaledinvesting.com. First week of the month, I call out my portfolio. During the month, I call out at least one potential multi-bagger stock that I think has that type of potential. And the reality is, just finding one potential multi-bagger in your life journey can change your life journey. If you find that company that could go up 500% or 1,000% over time, that's the trick, in my opinion, is to find those things and hold on to them over time. So my goal is to try to identify them and personally buy them. So each month I'm calling out new ideas. Let's dive back into what's going on here. And so the way I'm approaching this is that in China, you effectively have two types of customers. You have the senior customer, and then you have everyone else. And the senior customer is the Chinese Communist Party. And you need to be in good standing with the senior customer. When you're in good standing with the senior customer, then you have the right to do business. Then you have the right to grow, be profitable. But you need to first make sure, our mandate as a company is in line with whatever the CCP is doing. And this is, look, every country has its own culture. Every country has its own rules. This is how China operates, at least the way I understand it. I'd love to hear your thoughts, if you have any thoughts, in the comments below, where effectively the CCP says, this is the game that we are playing. If you want to be invested in these things, you need to understand the rules. And their rule number one is you have to align with whatever the CCP says. The CCP right now, one of their top priorities, making sure the population growth rate picks up. So they want to make sure, okay, you're not causing a problem with this tutoring where parents feel reluctant to have more kids. Okay, you got to fix that. Now, if you're a company that offers goods at a quality, quality goods at low prices, now the CCP might say, hey, you have our blessing. And that's why regular viewers know that I'm a shareholder in Alibaba Stock, and we'll talk more about that in a second. So if you do something that the CCP doesn't want you to do, then I think you're effectively uninvestable, because yeah, you might have a business model that works with the general citizens, but no, you got to address that senior customer first. And if that senior customer is not happy, you're going to have fines. You're effectively not going to be able to operate. And that's the way it seems like they're doing business. And so when I look at this, DD, I did a video recently on them, TAL, New Oriental Education. As I look at these, Honestly, it's just too hard for me, despite seeing this huge drop. Now, this is where a lot of people would think, oh, let's go bargain hunting. No, I'm thinking I need to respect the senior customer, and the senior customer is saying, no, we are changing the rules on you, and this is not the game that we're comfortable, or we're not happy with the way you did things with Didi in particular. So that's too hard for me. I'd rather look for something where you're in good standing with the senior customer and you're in good standing with everyone else. And so that's in all honesty is the trick. Is okay, how do you make sure you're at least making both parties happy? And so I personally own a basket of stocks, really primarily three companies that are about 25% of my portfolio. Alibaba is one of those companies that fits into this portfolio. I primarily own the Hong Kong shares because a lot of investors are concerned, oh, okay, the US is going to effectively force them to have some sort of accounting standards that directly match what the US wants, and then they're going to have to verify their books versus what China currently does. And so then China might just say, hey, screw it, we're not going to list these, or the US might force them to say, hey, you're not going to list these companies on the US exchanges. So there'll be a forced delisting in the future. So my mind is, what, that might cause short-term pain. Longer term, it appears that China is forcing investors, encouraging investors to say, hey, the Hong Kong exchange, that is where we are encouraging global investors. And that's why they've encouraged many companies, including Alibaba, to list their shares not only in the US, and that was several years ago, but now it's saying, hey, let's make sure you're on the Hong Kong exchange. That's their focus. Don't list on the US, list on Hong Kong. That's their mandate, because China wants to get bigger over time. They want a greater share of the global stage. And how are they going to do that? Part of it is by listing their best companies on the Hong Kong exchanges. And so that, if you're interested in my take on Alibaba, I did a deep dive on their valuation, why I think, I like it, despite this broad concern that the CCP could someday wake up and say, hey, this sector, as rumored, this sector is no longer going to be profitable. Like, could they do that with Alibaba, for example? I would be very surprised if they would do that. And I'm putting my money where my mouth is, because I'm effectively saying these are, I've repeated this over and over again, these are, China has seen a revolution over the last few decades, bringing hundreds of millions out of poverty. And they recognize capitalism with Chinese characters has so far worked for them. Now, every country has a different culture, once again, that needs to do things their own way. Some ways work better than the others. And so they're looking at this and they're saying these are some of the best companies we have that literally employ hundreds of thousands of people. So I look at it as saying, the CCP, as long as you don't have leadership that's out of line, that effectively doesn't stick their nose up to the CCP, if you follow what they say, you can have a right to do business and be lucrative and have a good business if you satisfy that senior customer first and then everyone else. So I view Alibaba as having been in the penalty box because of Jack Ma, but potentially getting out of it, as I'll talk about in a second with some more recent data points. And so my focus is, okay, let's make sure you find companies that are in good standing with the CCP, or at least seem to have a green light, and also good standing with everyone else. That's sort of the focus here. Now, I'm an American. I'm extremely grateful that I get to live in America. So I would not, I'm not looking to trade places and say, hey, I want to go live in China or something like that. I'm extremely grateful to be an American, to have this opportunity to invest on a global perspective. And that's exactly what this is. This isn't me saying, making a commentary on human rights or something like that. What I'm focused here as an investor, I'm putting on my investor hat, is sort of saying, I want to find reasonable, attractive risk reward. And I'm thinking the Chinese Communist Party isn't going to kill the golden geese of their country, including Alibaba, and that's why I own the Alibaba Hong Kong shares. And because of that, I think they can continue to grow over time because they seem to have a very strong or unrivaled value proposition. And so, and the stock also strikes me as really cheap and has a reasonable valuation. Now, could I be wrong? Of course, but once again, like, the way I'm viewing this is not a call on the social system or the government that I want to live under. This is a call on trying to find attractive risk reward throughout the world in a way that says, hey, will this country potentially respect the capital that goes in? And so far, if they cross the line and say, hey, these sectors start needing to operate on a nonprofit basis, that is a red line for me. Now, that's why I'm very curious to see how it plays out. I'd be super surprised if they do. And certainly if they start pointing to, let's say, these profitable sectors and saying, hey, your margins can't be there. You can't have these super lucrative business models. So that is something to be mindful of. I look at this business and I think it's printing a ton of cash and trades at a reasonable valuation. And so let's go on to the next component. So does Alibaba have that senior customer, the CCP approval? And this is where it gets really interesting. Where recently they talked about how an Ant Group director sees the relaunch of the IPO before too long. So this is just in the last few days that this came out, and this is super interesting to me because this is where the problems all began. When Jack Ma, right at the cusp of the Ant Financial IPO, stuck his, thumbed his nose to the Chinese Communist Party, saying, "Hey," he did this big speech saying, "You guys don't know what you're doing," and that is obviously a terrible decision to do when you have a senior customer like you do in China. You have this Chinese Communist Party. You can't say you don't know what you're doing. You have to respect what they're doing, otherwise operate in a different country. And so that's what happened. The IPO was pulled, saying, hey, we need to reconfigure this business model. It's grown super quickly. Now it is a director of Ant Financial is effectively saying, hey, we think we're going to be able to relist before too long. So I view that as a very favorable data point. It, like the other data points that you're seeing, like the rumor that the education sector can just be directed to become nonprofit, neither of these are official. So I view this as sort of data points to consider, but it's not necessarily like definitive on what's going on. But overall, look, the take is still try to find exceptional companies at compelling prices. And I think several companies in China have that, including Alibaba, and seeing this sort of favorable development does get me more excited about Alibaba stock. Now, if you want to follow my personal journey and some of the potential multi-baggers I call out each month, my most recent potential multi-bagger is a company growing at like 70 to 80% this year and trades at like 3 to 4 times sales and is profitable. That's what I'm looking for, this asymmetric risk reward. I think that's what I'm looking at with China right now. If you have a different take, I'd love to hear it. If you have different thoughts on this. And honestly, I totally respect other people's journeys where they're saying, you know what, this is too hard for me, or I can't, I just don't want to own it. That's part of the reason, like for a diversification perspective, I said, okay, I'm going to make it about a quarter of my personal portfolio. That's what I'm doing. Other people need to figure out what's right for them. And I think, that's a reasonable amount to put in. I'm probably not going to go much bigger than that on it. So that's how I'm thinking about managing my own risk reward. Anywho, if this video talking about the risk reward, what drove these stocks to decline today, what caused Chinese stocks in general to puke today, if this video has been helpful for you, please make a point of subscribing. If you're already a subscriber, I do appreciate that thumbs up. Thanks so much for watching.